بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Continuing on with our introduction to Mukhtasar al-Qudūrī, the next point we'll cover is something which is very important to fiqh, and this will explain to you the nature of fiqh. Just keep one thing in mind, that the Hanafiya, when they teach and when they codify fiqh, they're codifying law. Fiqh is law, and law has to be complete. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be based on what's prevalent, as opposed to rare occurrences. This is why we have a very important qa'idah, which is mentioned in the Majallah, and it's mentioned in many other books as well. And that is that al-ibratu lil-ghālib ash-shā'i' lā lin-nādir. When codifying fiqh and when explaining fiqh, we are going to consider that which is prevalent as opposed to that which is rare. What that means is, when we're writing down law, the law is based off of what's prevalent and what normally occurs, as opposed to rare scenarios. In fact, in many times, rare scenarios will not be considered whatsoever, in the sense that the ruling will be based entirely upon what is prevalent, and the rare scenario will have to follow that which is prevalent. This comes down to another qa'idah, that the nadir, the rare scenario, is going to follow that which is prevalent in its ruling. Now, al-Tahawi, in his commentary on the Majallah, he explains this qa'idah, this rule, al-ibratu lil-ghālib ash-shā'i' lā lin-nādir. Now, in certain commentaries on the Majallah, and likewise in commentaries on Qawā'id al-Fiqh, they explain this qa'idah in light of previous discussions that revolved around urf, that revolved around customs and norms. And they said that what this qa'idah refers to is, if a custom becomes prevalent, we will take it into consideration, as opposed to a custom which is not prevalent. Now, this whole discussion will come later, bi'idhnillah. When we teach you mu'amalat especially, we'll be focusing a lot more on urf, which are customs and norms. But al-Tahawi explains that, no, to be technically speaking, this qa'idah over here is not referring to that same discussion. This qa'idah is a stand-alone qa'idah, which has a completely different meaning. He says that when you look at the nusus, when you look at the discussions brought in the Sharia, you will find that discussions in the Sharia, again, those that are ma'qul al-ma'na. Why are we saying those that are ma'qul al-ma'na? Because these are the discussions where we understand the rationale behind the ruling. So these discussions will be tied to an illah. And of course, that illah, that legal cause, will be such a legal cause which is appropriate for the ruling at hand. When these discussions are tied to a legal cause, it might be the case that in certain scenarios, the actual legal cause is either unclear, or that actual legal cause is found over a spectrum. So what does that mean? The legal cause the ruling is actually supposed to be tied to is either unclear. We're not sure if it comes into existence or not. Number one. So it's an amr makhfi. Or number two, لا تدخلوا تحت الانضباط. Right? It's not set. It's not rigid. It's something which is very open. It's subjective. And on account of being very open, it can differ from person to person. Now, in these scenarios, if the legal cause is unknown, it's simply you're not aware of the legal cause. Number one. Or number two, this legal cause is such that it's subjective. It can change from person to person, and it can be interpreted in many different ways. This will lead to issues when it comes to applying law, because the law can be changed. Number one, if it's unknown, we'll never actually know if the legal cause it has come into existence or not. And because we won't know if the legal cause comes into existence, if we don't actually know that the legal cause came into existence or not, we won't be able to apply the ruling that revolves around the legal cause. Likewise, if the legal cause is something which is across a spectrum, it has a meaning which is very broad. It can be interpreted differently. This will result in another issue. And what is that other issue? That other issue is that what serves as a legal cause for one person, might not serve as a legal cause for another person. And this ruling in fiqh will differ from person to person. And when a person comes to court and there's a dispute, he'll say, in my understanding, from my perspective, the legal cause wasn't found because of such and such. And this will be a means which people can use in order to not erased per se, but in order to escape certain rulings of the Sharia. So again, you have a hukum. The hukum, again, a hukum which is, or a mashru', which is ma'qul al-ma'na, will be tied to a legal cause. Why are we saying it's ma'qul al-ma'na? Because we told you last week, or in our previous lesson, that the mashru'at are either ta'abbudiyya or ma'qul al-ma'na. Those which are ta'abbudiyya, they're devotional. We don't understand the logic behind them, but we act upon them. We act upon them in order to show our obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those which are ma'qul al-ma'na, which stem from a cause that is known to people, and these legal causes were able to extend the ruling onto other scenarios. So you have a hukum which is ma'qul al-ma'na. This hukum will be suspended upon an illah, a cause. Now, in certain times, in certain masail, certain discussions, if the cause is well known, it's not an issue. If the cause is apparent, it's not an issue. When the cause is found, the hukum, the legal ruling will be found. If the cause is found in a second scenario, in a third scenario, which we don't actually have in the text, but the cause due to which the hukum applies is found in a second or third or fourth scenario, we're going to extend the hukum and apply it to that second and third and fourth scenario as well. Very simple and very easy. The issue comes when the cause is either khafi. What does khafi mean? Generally speaking, it's not apparent. It's difficult to determine whether the cause actually came into existence or not because of how unclear, or because of the fact that it's hidden away. Or for instance, it is غير منضبط. It's far too broad. It is far too broad to set a ruling around it because it can change from person to person. Alright. In these scenarios, the fuqaha, they look at a second cause, what they refer to as the second cause, or the sabab al-lahir. They refer to it as the sabab al-lahir, or the second cause. They say, let's look at this illah. We have this illah, which generally speaking is khafi, or it's غير منضبط. Can we determine a scenario where majority of the instances, this cause will be found? In other words, can we determine a madhinna, an area where 9 times out of 10, this cause, which is khafi or غير منضبط, is bound to be found? If we can determine this scenario, instead of having the ruling be suspended upon this cause, which is khafi, it's غير منضبط, instead we're going to have the ruling be suspended upon the scenario in which 9 times out of 10 that cause is found. So we have a hukum, a ruling. We have a legal cause. If the legal cause is clear, if the legal cause is very rigid, it's clear, it's straightforward, in that scenario, the hukum will always revolve around the legal cause. But if that legal cause is such that it's khafi, it's hidden, or it's غير منضبط, it's difficult to, it's very broad, it can be interpreted in many different ways. Now we have to find a sabab lahir, or a madhinna, a scenario where majority of times that legal cause will be found. If that is the case, that this legal cause, which is either hidden or it's difficult to, it's very open to different, it's on a spectrum. It's maqula bit tashkik. It's open to a lot of different levels. We can take this legal cause and we can, instead of saying that the ruling will now revolve around the legal cause itself, we're going to say that the ruling revolves around that scenario in which 9 out of 10 times the legal cause will be present. Okay, so now the ruling will no longer revolve around the legal cause, rather the ruling will revolve around that scenario in which 9 times out of 10. It can be a sabab, it can be the cause for the cause. Sabab agreement is the cause for the cause. Or it can be, for instance, a scenario where generally speaking the cause will be found. Okay, the ruling will now revolve around that. Now I understand this is difficult to understand because it's all theory so far, but let's bring an example. Okay. The reasoning, why is qasr, why is shortening one's salah allowed in safar when a person is traveling? Okay, the Sharia has allowed a person to shorten his salah, and it has commanded a person to shorten his salah when traveling. The actual reasoning behind this, what's the actual reasoning behind this? The actual reasoning behind shortening one's salah when traveling is there's mashaqqa. When a person is traveling, there's difficulty. So once again, what is the hukum in this scenario? The hukum in this scenario is the qasr al-salah. A person is allowed to shorten his salah. Okay, the actual reasoning behind this, the actual legal cause behind this, which is the illah, is mashaqqa. There is difficulty when traveling. And because there's difficulty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed us to shorten, and He has commanded us to shorten our prayers. Okay, the issue over here is what? Mashaqqa, and something which is clear, it's apparent. You can see difficulty, but the issue over here is غير منضبط. Mashaqqa is la tanḍabit. Mashaqqa can differ from a person to person. Mashaqqa can differ from a person to person. So it's a wide spectrum. And then you can argue that so-and-so person isn't going through mashaqqa, whereas I, for instance, am. And others can argue that, no, you're not going into mashaqqa in comparison to others who might be going through much more hardship than you are. So if we were to have the hukum of qasr al-salah revolve around mashaqqa, it would be difficult, because in every other scenario, the argument can be made that mashaqqa isn't there. And in very simple and easy scenarios, the argument can be made that mashaqqa is there. So now we have to find a scenario where 9 out of 10 times, generally speaking, this is where our qaida comes into play. Al-ibratu lil-ghali bil-sha'i' la lin-nadir. Generally speaking, where is mashaqqa found? So we find that, generally speaking, mashaqqa is found in safar. Generally speaking, mashaqqa is found in safar. And because, generally speaking, mashaqqa is found in safar, we will now say that the ruling, which in reality should be revolving around mashaqqa, it should in reality revolve around mashaqqa, but because mashaqqa is غير منضبط, it's غير منضبطة, it's across a wide spectrum, we're going to see where 9 out of 10 times, generally speaking, where is mashaqqa found? Generally speaking, mashaqqa is found in safar, when a person is traveling. For this reason, the ruling of qasr al-salah will no longer be tied to mashaqqa. The ruling of qasr al-salah will no longer be tied to mashaqqa. Rather, now the ruling of shortening one's prayer will be tied to safar, irrespective of whether there is mashaqqa or not. You can be a king traveling with your entourage, right? You can be flying in the best plane, in the best seat, okay, without any issues whatsoever, without any difficulties. Is it safar? If it's safar, the ruling of qasr al-salah will be applied. Why? Because we said that generally speaking, where is mashaqqa found? And generally speaking, mashaqqa is found in safar. Now we're going to overlook mashaqqa altogether, and we're going to tie the ruling of qasr al-salah to safar. Why? Because al-ibratu lil-ghali bil-sha'i'. We're going to consider over here, generally speaking, where is mashaqqa found? It's found in safar. Now the ruling will revolve around it. You'll have these scenarios where certain people will travel comfortably. They're going to be luxurious in their travels. You'll have these scenarios where they won't find any difficulty whatsoever in their travels. But this is nadir. This is a rare scenario. So we're going to overlook that altogether. And that rare scenario will follow the ruling of the majority scenario. What's the majority? The majority of times when a person travels, there is mashaqqa. There is a degree of mashaqqa. So once again, we have a hukum, we have a ruling. That ruling is tied to an illah. However, in a certain scenario, if that illah is khafi, it's a hidden illah, or it's not mundabit, it's not easy to determine whether that illah is found. It's not easy to determine whether that illah is found or not. When we have a scenario like this, instead of tying the hukum to the illah, which is either unclear or it is difficult to, it's across a wide spectrum, right? It's across a wide spectrum. It's very broad. In this scenario, we're not going to tie the ruling to the illah anymore. We're going to tie the ruling to that scenario where majority of times, like I said, 9 out of 10 times, the illah would be found. Now the illah will be overlooked completely. All we're going to look for is that scenario found where, generally speaking, the illah should be found. If that scenario is found, then irrespective of whether the actual illah is there or not, the hukum will be applicable. Okay? Let's give another example. So over here, we give you an example of an illah which is غير منضبطة, right? Mashaqqa. Let's give an example of an illah which is khafiyya. Okay, generally speaking, why is a person, or what's the purpose or the benefit behind exchanging goods and transacting with others. The benefit behind exchanging good and transacting with others is that every person, right, they have certain commodities and certain products which others are in need of. And you yourself will have certain commodities and products which others are in need of. Now the question becomes, how do we peacefully exchange these commodities? Because if we don't have a peaceful method, people will start fighting over this. People will start arguing over this. Right? There's going to be bloodshed in order for one person to gain something which another person doesn't have. So since this is the case, we have to create a system in which it's possible for people to exchange commodities without bloodshed, without issues, without problems. Okay, what is the system? The system which we're going to create is the bay' system, transactions. Okay, by allowing transactions will allow people who have commodities to exchange their commodities with others who have the commodities they want. Okay, so whenever there's a demand, you know for a fact that my commodity is required by so-and-so person, and I require either the commodity he wants or the median through which I can purchase another commodity, i.e. money. Okay, in this scenario, peacefully you can exchange your commodity with his. Now the question becomes, what is the main cause? Why are we allowing for a person to change his wealth for another person? The hikmah, the reasoning behind this is to make things peaceful and to allow people to fulfill their needs. Now obviously in order to fulfill that, there needs to be taradi. There needs to be mutual consent. Both parties need to be happy with exchanging their milkiyah, their ownership over an item for another item. So the hukum over here is naqlul milkiyah. When you do a transaction, what happens in a transaction? Your ownership over your item will be transferred to the party you're transacting with, and his ownership over his item or his commodity, his product, will be transferred to yourself. So this is the hukum over here. What's the actual reasoning, the actual illah behind this hukum? Now we're going to make this very simple. There's actually a longer discussion over here. But the actual benefit or the actual reasoning, the legal reasoning behind naql al-milkiyya, let's say over here that it is al-rida fi al-tijara. Al-rida fi al-tijara. I changed the color of the hukum, didn't I? Naql al-milkiyya. We'll keep our hukum over here, our ruling in green. Again, this is just an example to help you understand the concept properly. Naql al-milkiyya. Okay, what's the illah behind naql al-milkiyya? In reality, the illah is to relieve yourself of your need. You have a need to fulfill. Okay, you have a need to fulfill, and the best way to do so is to take this commodity which another person has. Okay, now in order to do that, you have to be happy. There needs to be consent. You need to be willing to sell your item to the other person, and he needs to be willing to sell his item to yourself. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. A commodity, a transaction should be based off of عن تراض منكم. There needs to be taradi, consent from both sides. Both sides need to be willing to exchange this commodity over which they have ownership. So the actual reasoning behind naql al-milkiyya is there's taradi. Both sides are happy. They're content to exchange their commodity. We'll just write the taradi. Alright. Happiness or willingness to exchange one's commodity, is that something which is clear? Can you see it? The answer is no. So over here, this actual reasoning behind naql al-milki, which is taradi, happiness, consent, alright, or willingness, this actual reasoning is not apparent. You can't see it. So over here, the illah in this scenario happens to be khafiyya. Now that the illah happens to be khafiyya, the question comes into play. If the illah is khafiyya, how are we going to have the hukam, which is naql al-milkiyya, the transfer of ownership, revolve around this illah khafiyya, revolve around this reasoning with this cause, which you can't even see, which you can't even determine. So for this reason, we look and we determine where is it the case that majority of the times taradi is found. Where can we say that 9 out of 10 times taradi will be found? Well, when we say that, we find that 9 out of 10 times taradi is found in al-siyagh الدالة على العقود, or على التراضي to be exact. الصيغة الدالة على التراضي. Expressions which indicate happiness, which indicate willingness to transact. So taraḍi is something that occurs within your heart. But how do I determine whether taraḍi is there? 9 out of 10 times if you say, I've sold you this item, you're happy with it. You're willing to be exact, not happiness, but you're willing to sell it. So what is the sabab zahir? At-taraḍi might be the illa khafiyya. For our purposes, we're going to say that at-taraḍi is the illa khafiyya. This illa khafiyya, 9 out of 10 times, is found within as-siyagh ad-dallatu al-taraḍi. Expressions and phrases or sentences which indicate happiness, which a person actually vocalizes, which a person actually says. Anything which is indicative of his willingness to sell this item. Because generally speaking, taraḍi, which is an illa khafiyya, is found in as-siyagh ad-dallatu ala taraḍi. Statements that indicate happiness. We're going to say that the ruling of naql al-milkiyya, the ruling of transferring ownership, should revolve around not something which is hidden away in your heart, at-taraḍi, but rather it should revolve around as-siyagh ad-dallatu ala taraḍi. Those statements that indicate a willingness to exchange ownership or to transfer ownership. Otherwise, a person might come to a shop, he might walk into a store, and in his heart, he feels the need, or he's willing to purchase. Let's assume it's a bookstore. He's willing to purchase a book, but he doesn't say anything. He takes the book and he walks out of the store. What's going to happen? There needs to be an indication, one way or another, that shows that this person is happy. He is willing to purchase this item. Generally speaking, how do we know that taraḍi occurs? It occurs when there are statements which a person utters or actions that a person does that are indicative of his willingness and his happiness to purchasing this item. So for this reason, the ruling of transferring ownership will not revolve around the willingness or happiness itself. Why? Because it's an amr makhfi. We can't see it. We can't determine it. Rather, it's going to revolve around a matter where generally speaking, al-ibratu lil-ghalib ash-sha'i' la lin-nadir. Generally speaking, in this scenario, happiness will be found. Okay, and perhaps you've come across an example of this in your lessons on uqubat as well. Why does Abu Hanifa differ with Abu Yusuf and Muhammad? It comes back to this. There's an amr makhfi, so we have to determine the ruling and have the ruling revolve around a sabab zahir. That sabab zahir will be the base of the ruling, irrespective of that amr makhfi moving forward. Okay, so with this we understand two things. This is a very important qaida, and we're going to come across this again and again in fiqh, which is why I'm mentioning it over here. And quite a bit of fiqh revolves around this qaida, that when you have an illa, you have a cause, you have a reasoning, which is either غير منضبطة, it's on a wide spectrum, or it is khafiyya, it's difficult to determine on account of the fact that it's hidden, it's not apparent. Then we're going to look for a cause or a madhinna, a place where generally speaking that illa is found. Not all the time, generally speaking. لأن العبرة للغالب الشائع لا للنادر. And then we're going to have the hukum, the actual ruling, which should be revolving around the illah. We'll say no, it no longer revolves around the illah. Now it revolves around that scenario or that cause, which would generally result in the illah being found. And with this, you've understood a very important qaida in fiqh. Of course, there's more detail to this, but for now, just keep this in mind. All right. Now this al-ibratu lil-ghalib ash-sha'i' la lin-nadir, this isn't just restricted to this qaida. Again, this qaida is based off of the ruling I just taught you right now. This whole idea when you have an illa which is khafiyya or ghayr mundabita, and there's either a sabab zahir or a madhinna, which generally speaking the illa is found, right? This qaida, al-ibratu lil-ghalib ash-sha'i' affects this. Why does it affect this? Because we're saying that generally speaking the illa is found. But it also affects a whole other spectrum of fiqh. Okay, so al-ibratu lil-ghalib ash-sha'i' is very, very effective, and it's very general in fiqh. And like I said, it all comes down to the fact that fiqh is law. When you're making law, you're not looking at rare scenarios. You're not taking rare occurrences into consideration. You are looking at the general state of society. And this is important to understand. Sometimes you have a ruling which the Sharia has given, taking into consideration the general state of society. A person will come and say, wait a minute, I personally, in my life, based on my experience, the reasoning of that ruling doesn't apply to me. The reasoning of that ruling does not apply to me. So shouldn't it be permissible for me, for instance, to go against that ruling? Because the reasoning of that ruling doesn't apply to me. We're going to say to him that fiqh does not look at your individual scenario. it looks at society as a whole. Fiqh will look at what is prevalent within society, and based on that, the hukm will be applicable, not based on your individual scenario or your little town that you're living in. No, fiqh will be based on the entire society as a whole. And keep in mind that the fiqh which the Sharia has sent is not just for the 14th century or the 21st century. The fiqh which the Sharia has sent is for all times and all places. And that's the beauty of the Sharia, that it's applicable to the 1st century after Hijrah, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century. And it's applicable to us in the 14th century as well. Fiqh is applicable to all of us. And the reasoning behind this is the beauty in this qaida, al-ibratul ghali bil-sha'i' la lin-nadir. Fiqh doesn't take into consideration what might be prevalent within a very small minority. Rather, fiqh will be based on what is prevalent, generally speaking, in the society. Okay, now there's more detail in the qaida, obviously. It's not like we will overlook minorities. We're going to look at much more aspects in this, or many more aspects with regards to this. But this is just a general explanation of this qaida. Keep this in mind because it's going to help you when it comes to fiqh or understanding fiqh. Now, finally, we move on to discussing who al-Imam al-Qudūrī, the great scholar who wrote this blessed book, who wrote the Mukhtasar, is. Al-Imam al-Qudūrī is the faqih of Iraq, the great jurist of Iraq, and the Shaykh of the Hanafiya, the leading scholar of the Hanafiya in his time, Abu al-Husayn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Ja'far ibn Hamdan al-Baghdadi al-Qudūrī. Why is he called Qudūrī? We're not sure. It's possible Qudur refers to pots. This Qudur, the singular of it, refers to pots, right? So it's possible someone and his parents or in his forefathers would sell pots. Maybe it's possible they would make pots, or it's possible it's in relationship, or it's an attribution to a village which his family came from. We're not sure. Okay. Imam Qudūrī studied by Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Jurjani. This is important. Why is this important? Because al-Jurjani studied by al-Jassas Abu Bakr al-Razi, one of the greatest jurists of the Hanafi school, who authored many books, who in turn studied by Abil Hasan al-Karkhi, who is his teacher, and he also authored many books in the school, who studied by Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i, who studied by Abu Ali al-Daqqaq, who studied by Abu Sahal Musa ibn Nasr al-Razi, who studied by al-Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. And later on we'll cover the chain of Imam al-Qudūrī to the school. But what you have to understand is this over here, this entire chain, is a chain which revolves around the scholars of Iraq. Why am I making point of this? Because in the earlier centuries of the Hanafiya, the earlier centuries of the Hanafiya, the earlier tradition, we find that the school of Iraq was very strong in Hanafi fiqh. Later on, the fiqh of the Hanafiya ended up extending or moving towards ma wara al-Nahr, the region of Khurasan, etc. But earlier on, the fiqh of the Hanafiya was very prevalent in Iraq. And this makes sense because Abu Hanifa himself was from Kufa, and his students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, spread the fiqh of the Hanafiya in Iraq. And Abu Yusuf was the Qadi al-Qudā'i, became the head judge in Iraq. And as a result of that, obviously, many of the judges he appointed throughout Iraq were all Hanafiya. And so the fiqh of the Hanafiya spread a lot in Iraq in its earlier generations. And then it passed on to their students and their students. That's why you'll find that Qudūrī's students, right, they were at Damaghani, etc. They became the head judges. Damaghani and his family, in fact, he was the head judge, or their family was the head judge in Iraq for quite some time, or they had that status. So the fiqh of the Hanafi in its earlier generations was very prevalent in Iraq, and it was very strong. It was very strong in Iraq, and then it passed on to ma wara al-Nahr, and then it passed on to other countries such as Egypt, and then it spread across the globe. In the recent century, it was very strong in India, or even until now it is very strong, and not in India per se, but it's a continent. So the fiqh of the Hanafi has spread across all these areas. May Allah bless and give al-Imam Abu Hanifa the greatest of rewards, for spreading and teaching us this fiqh. Now, the fiqh of Iraq is important because earlier scholars in the madhab, the Iraqi school, they had, of course, the Hanafiya in usul, in terms of usul, their usul is found within the scholars of Iraq and the other scholars as well. But the scholars of Iraq had a very specific approach to usul. And this is why in certain scenarios in the books of usul, when you open the books of usul, you'll find differences between the scholars of Iraq and those that came afterwards. Imam Qudūrī was clearly on the view of those scholars who were from Iraq because he himself was Iraq. In majority of the times, his usul is in line with the Iraqi tradition of the Hanafiya. This is not a big issue at this level, But later on, when you cover books in more detail, you'll come across this much more. All right. And generally speaking, al-Kashmiri actually makes a point that the books of the scholars of Iraq are much stronger in fiqh than later books in the school. Generally speaking, he says, the books of the scholars of Iraq are much stronger in terms of fiqh, in terms of their method or their understanding of discussions than later books within the school. Imam Qudūrī also narrates hadith. So he doesn't narrate that many hadith, but he actually has a juz. He has a section which a whole article, you could say, which he has in a hadith which he narrates from his teacher Muhammad bin Ali al-Mu'addib. He also narrated from al-Hawshabi, and one of his students is al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who is a Shafi'i scholar, famous historian. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi passed away in the year 463. He's a Shafi'i scholar, and he says about al-Qudūrī that he was extremely well versed in fiqh, and he became the leading scholar of the Hanafiya in Iraq, and they revered him, they treated him with respect, they understood his value, and al-Imam al-Qudūrī was very well versed when he was speaking. He was not afraid to say things, and he would always recite the Quran. This is a lesson for us that when we look at the biography of these great scholars or the biographies of these great scholars, we always find that they had a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that extended beyond mere academia. It wasn't just fiqh, it wasn't just hadith, but also the fact that they would pray at night, also the fact that they would stand at night, also the fact that they would recite Quran throughout the day, etc., etc. So we have to bring these qualities into our lives, just as we try to bring academia into our life. And obviously, ilm, academia, if we're done with the right intentions, is a form of ibadah. It's a great form of ibadah, but along with that, we also bring other forms of ibadah into our lives. Now, Imam Qudūrī, although he didn't narrate much a hadith, he was very well versed, or to a degree, he was proficient in hadith. He was fluent in hadith. He wasn't weak in hadith per se. That's why Imam Khatib Baghdadi himself, despite being a Shafi'i jurist who wasn't too fond of the Hanafiya, to say the least, he also narrates from al-Qudūrī, called him Saduq. He said he's trustworthy. Sam'ani refers to him as faqihan, kana faqihan saduqa. He was a trustworthy jurist. And in his book, At-Tajdeed, Imam Qudūrī has a large book called At-Tajdeed, which he began dictating in the year 405. One of his earlier books, because Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi, which is another book of Qudūrī, he authored later. We'll come across the books of Qudūrī later on, bi'idhnillah. But in his Tajdeed, you find that al-Imam al-Qudūrī, he actually quotes a lot of discussions from different huffaz, different scholars in hadith. All right, and he gives answers when there's a need for answer, and he supports them when he feels that they're correct in their discussions. So he was very well versed, or he understood the ilal, for instance, the ilal of ad-Daraqutni very well. Now, does this mean he had the entire ilal memorized? Some have interpreted the statement in this manner, but it doesn't seem to be the case that he's saying this. He simply said he had a good recollection. He had a good understanding of the ilal of ad-Daraqutni. Okay, and Imam Qudūrī, along with being a great scholar, he would also debate, and his debate would be with other Shafi'i scholars. Now, these debates weren't debates in which every party or each party hates each other, or they have issues. No, they were respectful debates amongst great scholars, and despite debating each other, Imam Qudūrī would often debate a Sheikh Abu Hamid al-Isfarayini, who was a great Shafi'i scholar. But despite that, al-Qudūrī would go out of his way to respect him. Al-Qudūrī would go out of his way to praise him. Right? And he would say about him that, I have not seen any Shafi'i who understands fiqh better than Abu Hamid. This is someone he's debating with. So we understand from this sincerity. Because oftentimes in debates it's difficult. If you're debating with someone, it's difficult to praise them. Why is it difficult? Because praising them gives their argument strength, or it gives their personality or their status strength in front of people. But al-Qudūrī wouldn't mind this because he was sincere. And this is something else we find, that debating is something which is found within our tradition. But along with debating, a person needs to be sincere. A person needs to be respectful. And there's nothing wrong with this. The scholars will always differ. Great scholars will always differ. There's nothing wrong with this. And they should differ, because this is what creates academia. And it's what makes our academia so rich. But along with that, there needs to be respect, especially from the students. Oftentimes when two scholars differ, it's not actually the scholars who cause issues. This is actually mentioned as well by in al-Jawahir al-Mudhi'a. These scholars who debate, oftentimes they have students who are very muta'assib. Like, they're very stubborn or staunch supporters of their teacher. So they will never turn away from their teacher. And these are the students who oftentimes will cause issues. So we don't want to create this. We don't want to create a cultish mentality. You want to create a mentality where there is respect for our teachers. Just as we respect our teachers. Of course, if someone has helped you and he's guided you through a lot, our respect for him will be more than our respect for other teachers. But that doesn't give us the right to look down on other scholars, to shun other scholars, or to disrespect other scholars and their work. Discussions should be academic, they should be respectful, they should be fruitful, and they should be void of any malice and hate and enmity towards other Muslims. All right, over here we have the chain of al-Imam al-Qudūrī, who studied fiqh by Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Jurjani, who studied by al-Jassas. Al-Jassas is important. Why is al-Jassas important? He's very important in the school because he has multiple books in the school. And al-Qudūrī himself quotes from al-Jassas. In many of his books, you'll find him quoting al-Jassas's understanding in the school. So he has many books in the school. We'll just mention a few books over here. One of the books he's authored is an excellent commentary on al-Tahawi's Mukhtasar. Who is al-Tahawi? Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, one of the greatest scholars of the school as well. Al-Tahawi is a student of Abu Khazim. They say that he studied by fiqh by Abu Khazim and another qadi, Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi. Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi authored a number of books. He's more famous for his books in hadith. The Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, which is a beautiful book in the Hanafi tradition, in which he gathered ahadith and explained the Hanafi view in light of those ahadith which he gathered. He has other books as well. One of his books in fiqh is the Mukhtasar, the famous Mukhtasar of al-Imam al-Tahawi. Now, Imam Tahawi's Mukhtasar, remember the earlier scholars, they wrote Mukhtasarat. This was a genre in the earlier generations. Imam Qudūrī, you could say, was the pinnacle or the end point of this genre to a degree. After him, the genre of mutun began. Mutun, which are primers, small primers which are written in order to establish the correct view in the school. Now, al-Tahawi wrote his Mukhtasar, and the Mukhtasar was commented on by different scholars, al-Bijabi being one of them. One of the scholars who wrote a commentary on al-Tahawi's Mukhtasar was none other than al-Jassas al-Razi. Al-Jassas al-Razi wrote his Sharhu Mukhtasar al-Tahawi, and this is a beautiful commentary. It covers very good points of fiqh in the madhab, and it shows how the madhab works. It shows the system of, or the structure of the madhab, and Al-Jassas is someone who really applies usul. You'll find that he applies the usul which you've learned in the books of usul in his books. Now, obviously, at this level, I would not suggest for you to read these books. Even if you're studying Hidayah, in fact, I would not be sure, depending on the level of the student, obviously, if it's the best time for him to read the commentary of Al-Jassas. But beyond that, and if a student is very hardworking, he should certainly open the commentary and compare with other books and see the fiqh, understand the fiqh of Al-Jassas al-Razi, which he has taken from his teachers and other scholars. So he wrote Sharh Mukhtasar al-Tahawi, which is a commentary on the Mukhtasar. And Jassas in general was very much affected by al-Tahawi's books. Jassas, by the way, also narrates the Sunan of Abu Dawood. Imam Abu Dawood, he has multiple students who narrate from him, one of them being Abu Bakr bin Dasa. So Al-Jassas in his Sharh Mukhtasar al-Tahawi, he'll narrate the ahadith in Sunan Abi Dawood from the pathway of Abu Bakr bin Dasa. Okay, now al-Tahawi, he has other books, like I mentioned. One of his books was Ahkam al-Quran. Right, those fiqh matters that are established from Ayatul Ahkam. Like I said, Al-Jassas was very fond of al-Tahawi. He followed him in writing a similar book in the same genre. He also wrote an Ahkam al-Quran, which is quite famous. All right. And along with that, al-Tahawi also has Ikhtilaf al-Ulama, in which he recounted the khilaf of the scholars, the Greek scholars in the earlier centuries. Al-Jassas actually summarized this. So we don't have Ikhtilaf al-Ulama itself today. We have Jassas's Ikhtisar Ikhtilaf al-Ulama, or Ikhtisar Ikhtilaf al-Ulama. Okay, again, all of Jassas's books are very good, but you have to be careful in certain scenarios. This is why I say that these books are not necessarily ideal for beginners. Give it some time, learn the school thoroughly, and then by all means access his books once you've understood different sciences to a basic degree. And if there's questions, of course, refer back to your teachers and ask them. But Al-Jassas has a lot of good books written in the school, and he's very learned. Al-Jassas studied by al-Karkhi. Al-Karkhi was the great scholar of Iraq prior to Al-Jassas, and he was very respected in Iraq as a great standing, a strong Hanafi, and he actually wrote a Mukhtasar. Al-Karkhi wrote a Mukhtasar, and this is important to us because Al-Karkhi's Mukhtasar, again, Al-Karkhi is Jassas's teacher. He wrote a Mukhtasar. This Mukhtasar of Al-Karkhi was later commented on by none other than al-Qudūrī. Al-Qudūrī is the one who authored Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi. Okay. And the first thing to understand is, number one, Qudūrī authored this book, but he had authored this book, Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi, after authoring his Tajdeed. I told you Tajdeed was an amazing book written by Qudūrī, which covered the differences between the Shafi'i and Hanafi schools of thought, generally speaking. And he defended the Hanafi school of thought, and he argued against the Shafi'iyya in this book, at-Tajdeed. After writing at-Tajdeed is quite extensive. He wrote Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi. And he says that I've already written in detail in at-Tajdeed, and for this reason, I have written to a moderate level, not that detailed, not that short, in Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi. I've explained the rulings. If there's need to mention riwayat in the school, I've mentioned them. If there's need to mention other aspects in the school, I will mention them. And then I will explain the ruling in simple and easy language. Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi. Now, one thing to keep in mind is al-Karkhi, when he first started writing the Mukhtasar, it was quite short. So Mukhtasar literally means a short book, right? An abridgment. So in the beginning, he wrote it. It was quite short in the beginning. But later on, he started adding in more detail in the matan, or in the text itself. So that's why from like the chapter of Ibādāt onwards, after Ibādāt, the Mukhtasar of Karkhi is longer. And then when he reaches al-Rahan, he goes into a lot more detail until the end of the book. So al-Qudūrī, when he's seeing this, he said that I decided that it would be appropriate to add in certain texts to the beginning of the book so that the two sides of the book are equal in the amount of information there is in the Mukhtasar. And then I'll commentate on that. Now, what ended up happening as a result of this, or one of the results from this, is that we can't actually differentiate, and at least in the published edition which we have to date, we can't differentiate between, generally speaking, it's difficult to differentiate between what Qudūrī is saying and what al-Karkhi is saying, because their wordings are mixed, their language is mixed to a degree. Despite that being the case, again, like I mentioned to you, the book is beautiful. It's filled with gems, it's filled with fawaid fiqhiyya, and it plays a big role in later books that came in the madhab. For instance, Tuhfat al-Fuqaha al-Samarqandi and al-Kasani's Bada'i' al-Sana'i'. He references Qudūrī quite a bit in that book. In majority, and a lot of his discussions, we could say, are similar, if not taken directly from Qudūrī himself. Alright. Al-Karkhi studied by Abu Khazim and Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i. Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i we've mentioned in the chain of al-Qudūrī, one of the great scholars of Iraq, and you'll find mention of him in the earlier books of the school. He in turn studied by both Musa al-Razi and Ismail bin Hammad, who studied by Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. The former studied by Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, and the latter studied by the son of Abu Hanifa, Hammad bin Abi Hanifa, both of whom studied by Abu Hanifa. Muhammad also studied by Abu Yusuf. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan also studied extensively by Abu Yusuf. On the other hand, Abu Khazim, this is a short chain, by the way. There's a lot more that can be mentioned here, a lot more names. We're just trying to keep it simple and easy to understand. Abu Khazim studied by Bakr ibn Muhammad and Hilal ibn Yahya. Hilal studied by Zufar and Abu Yusuf. Okay, Zufar bin Hudayl, this is the scholar, one of Abu Hanifa's great students, who actually took his place after Abu Hanifa passed away. But it wasn't that long before he too met his Lord and passed away in the year 158. But Zufar bin Hudayl, you'll find his name mentioned quite a lot in the books of fiqh. In the books of the Hanafiyyah, they'll mention Zufar's opinions quite a bit. And in certain scenarios, very rare scenarios, the fatwa is actually on al-Imam Zufar's opinion. Generally speaking, that's not the case. And generally speaking, when you have opinions mentioned in the books of the Hanafiyyah, it's Abu Hanifa's opinion, Abu Yusuf's opinion, and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's opinion. Okay, Zufar's opinion will also be mentioned. But fatwa, generally speaking, is on Abu Hanifa's opinion, sometimes Abu Yusuf's opinion, sometimes Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's opinion. But the common factor and majority of rulings is that you'll find all of their opinions. Abu Hanifa's opinion will be mentioned, Abu Yusuf's opinion will be mentioned, and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's opinion will be mentioned. In certain scenarios, their opinions are not mentioned. For instance, Abu Hanifa's opinion is mentioned, but we're not sure Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's opinion. This is when later scholars like Karkhi, like al-Jassas, like al-Qudūrī will come along and say, according to the understanding of Abu Yusuf, this should be his opinion. It's called takhrij. Abu Yusuf's opinion is, in and of itself, is not actually mentioned. But a later scholar comes and says that according to Abu Yusuf's understanding, so and so, or this should be his opinion. This is called takhrij. And this happens a lot. And oftentimes, or not oftentimes, but sometimes, scholars can make mistakes. When doing takhrij, they can make mistakes. And that's why you'll find Qudūrī, for instance, saying that so and so, this is Karkhi's takhrij, or this is al-Jassas's takhrij, but it's actually incorrect. The better takhrij would be so and so. Which perhaps another scholar in the madhab has already mentioned prior to Qudūrī as well. So this is something which is prevalent in the school, the earlier books within the school. You have opinions attributed to Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad, and Zufar. Sometimes they themselves have mentioned this because Imam Muhammad had quite a few books in which these opinions are codified. And other times, their opinions are not mentioned, but later scholars, by later scholars we're referring to these masters of the school, al-Karkhi, al-Jassas, al-Qudūrī, who had all the books of the Imam in front of them, or not all the books, but a good amount of the books, and they had read through these books, they had understand them, they studied them from their teachers. They will come along and they will say, based on my understanding, Abu Yusuf and so mas'ala would have said this. And if he's incorrect, a later scholar will come and say, well, that's true, that's one aspect, but to be fair, he made a mistake. Abu Yusuf would have actually said this. So you will find this within the school. And this is the beauty of a madhab. When you study a madhab, it's not just one scholar. It's not just one scholar, it's 12 centuries of scholarship. Each century that comes after the first will correct and will filter what was mentioned by the earlier century. And this is the beauty of a madhab, which you will not find outside of the madhahib, on account of the fact that other scholars might not have been blessed with students like these scholars of the madhab and their students were blessed with. All right. Finally, we have Abu Bakr bin Muhammad Salim bin Muhammad ibn Sama'a, who studied both by Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, all of whom, Hamad bin Abi Hanifa, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, Abu Yusuf, and Zufar bin Hudayl, studied by Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan also studied by Abu Yusuf. He also studied by Abu Yusuf, and he also studied by al-Imam Malik. Now, it's time to learn or understand a few terms used by the scholars of the madhab. Generally speaking, like I mentioned to you, the opinion of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad is mentioned. So that's in total, we have 3 scholars here, right? Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad. Abu Hanifa is obviously the oldest of them, then Abu Yusuf, and then Muhammad. And in certain scenarios, you also have Zufar bin Hudayl's opinion being mentioned. You'll also have Zufar bin Hudayl's opinion being mentioned. If in the books you find, for instance, the Hanafi scholar saying, Inda a'immatina al-thalatha, according to our 3 scholars, who are the most influential scholars in the madhab? Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad. So in the a'immatina al-thalatha would refer to Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad. This would be, for instance, as opposed to Zufar. After this, they might mention Zufar's opinion, who's also a scholar of the madhab, a great scholar. When you say in the a'immatina al-thalatha, it refers to Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad. Now, what if an opinion is held by Abu Hanifa and it's not held by Abu Yusuf and Muhammad? How do we differentiate? So in this scenario, for instance, you would say, if Abu Hanifa holds opinion, right? This is, Abu Hanifa is the Shaykh, he's a teacher. Abu Hanifa, they can refer to him as al-Imam, for instance. Or in the Imam. Or sometimes they just bring a singular pronoun. Wa'anhu, wa'indahu. That singular pronoun at the end, you have to understand to refer to Abu Hanifa. Wa'anhu, it's been transmitted from him. Wa'indahu, according to him. And on the other hand, when referring to his 2 students who differed with him, because they're his students, they would refer to them as as-sahiban. When you hear the Hanafi jurist, when you see the Hanafi jurist writing as-sahiban or in the sahibain, it refers to Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. Now, what if Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf agree on an opinion? Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf as opposed to al-Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. In this scenario, you'd find them referring to Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf as al-Shaykhain or al-Shaykhan. Right. Oftentimes they say al-Shaykhain because generally speaking in the books you have an inda before it. This is so-and-so is the opinion in the Shaykhain. Now, so-and-so is the opinion according to al-Shaykhain. And al-Shaykhain in the scenario, as I mentioned to you, is referring to Abu Yusuf and Abu Hanifa. Why are they called the Shaykhain? Because they both taught Imam Muhammad and they were older. Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf were both older than al-Imam Muhammad. And this would be contrasted with Imam Muhammad's opinion. Now, in this scenario, if you have a Shaykhain first, being mentioned first, and then you have Anhu, for instance, let's assume you have Anhu over here being mentioned. This Anhu in this scenario would not refer to Abu Hanifa, it would refer to Imam Muhammad. So you have to look at the context. If you have a Sahiban mentioned, and it's in contrast to an opinion attributed to Anhu, that who would refer to Abu Hanifa. On the other hand, if you have a Shaykhan mentioned, and it's in contrast with an opinion attributed to Anhu, then Anhu over there would refer to al-Imam Muhammad. Now, what if Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad agree on an opinion, as opposed to Abu Yusuf? So, Abu Hanifa is number 1, Abu Yusuf is number 2, and Muhammad is number 3. What are the two edges? If Abu Hanifa and Muhammad agree on an opinion, these are the two, they're in the edges. They're in the edge of the teacher list, right? The chart. So therefore, they refer to this as al-Tarafan. The two edges, or the two ends, refers to Abu Hanifa and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. So and so is the opinion in the Tarafain. وقال Abu Yusuf. And then they'll mention Abu Yusuf's opinion. وقال Abu Yusuf, for instance. Okay, these are just certain words that are used by in the books to make things easier to understand, and you should be aware of them both when studying, when listening to our lessons, and likewise when actually accessing the books. It will make things easier for you to understand. Generally speaking, fatwa generally speaking is given on Abu Hanifa's opinion. However, you will have scenarios when the scholars of the method decide that no, Abu Yusuf's opinion is more appropriate here, Muhammad's opinion is more appropriate here, for multiple reasons which they have. Now, what are the reasons? This is going to be taught in later books in more detail. But just keep this in mind for now. With this, we've covered the biography of al-Imam al-Qudūrī. What we have left regarding al-Imam al-Qudūrī is his students. I'm just going to mention one student for now. And that student will be al-Aqba. He has multiple students. Imam al-Qudūrī has a lot of students. And they say that he would teach 12 lessons a day. And he has many students, but one of the students who stands out is Abu Nasr Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Aqba. Now, why does he stand out? The reason he stands out is because he has a commentary on his teacher's Mukhtasar. So again, Imam al-Qudūrī has different books. He has Tajreed, earliest book he wrote. Then he has Mukhtasar al-Karkhi. And he also has the Mukhtasar in the madhab, which we're going to be studying right now, bi'idhnillah. One of the earliest commentaries on the Mukhtasar is authored by Abu Nasr al-Aqba, who they say has two commentaries. He has a longer commentary and a shorter commentary. And the benefit of these commentaries, they've been printed now. Again, I don't suggest for you guys at this level to access his commentaries, but later on you can look through his commentaries. The benefit of his commentaries is the fact that oftentimes he quotes Qudūrī verbatim. He won't actually take his name. He won't mention his name sometimes, but the wording he uses is the exact same wording al-Qudūrī used in Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi, or for instance in another book of his titled al-Taqrīb. Al-Aqba will quote those books word to word. So in that sense, the commentary is really good. And the other benefit of Al-Aqba's commentary is he was aware of the difference in nusakh, in the manuscripts of the Mukhtasar. Because again, books earlier on, they weren't printed. Students would write manuscripts based off of their teacher's manuscript. So Al-Aqba was aware of the differences in the Mukhtasar, and he would highlight these differences from time to time. So his Sharh is one of the legendary commentaries on the Qudūrī, which again, you don't have to access this at this level, but bi'idhnillah, at a later level, you will be able to access it. The next discussion, which we'll cover tomorrow, inshallah, is the Mukhtasar itself. The Mukhtasar itself, which holds one of the greatest ranks in the madhab, if not the greatest ranks, in terms of the books that are commented, that are authored, and the books that stem from it, that surround it. The Mukhtasar is a legendary book, which we will cover tomorrow, bi'idhnillah, starting with the methodology of al-Imam al-Qudūrī fi Mukhtasari, and continuing on with the legacy of the Mukhtasar, which is found through different books across the madhab. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.